After several months of studying this, I eventually came to the conclusion that histrionic personality disorder is the most likely, most helpful explanation for Shanann Watts' behavior. Not necessarily the full-blown clinical personality disorder, but somewhere on that spectrum, putting her there would be the most helpful if she were still alive needing treatment. So that's my conclusion at the end of the day. If you want to learn how I got there, this video is probably going to be about an hour, maybe a little bit over. Let me explain it to you, how I got to that conclusion, the process, how many times I changed my mind, how many other disorders I've considered, and why exactly I'm singling out this one personality disorder out of all the other possibilities. And also, how have I determined that her behavior constitutes clinical evaluation when Chris's behavior doesn't, in my opinion. So this is the Shanann Watts psychological analysis video. So first of all, how dare I? What I'm doing is I'm victim blaming. Shanann Watts was the victim in the Chris Watts case. She was murdered along with her 2 children. How dare I try to armchair diagnose this person when they were a victim and they have this victim status? Shanann didn't deserve to die. This was all Chris, and it's immoral to hint at any criticism of a murder victim. It's just immoral to ever criticize murder victims, period. Sure, it's okay to analyze her, but you mustn't ever imply she was at fault or liable for any of these crimes. So some people will say it's okay to analyze her given that you always start it with assuming that she's not at fault for anything, she's not liable for anything. That's the attitude of a lot of people. I don't share that attitude. Let me tell you why. The idea of partial guilt versus total guilt. What I see a lot of people do is they look at the crimes, they say that Chris acted guilty, and because he acted guilty, that means he killed everyone. That means he was entirely responsible for everything. He may have had an accomplice, but at the end of the day, he's responsible for everything. He is totally guilty. The way we reach that conclusion is by looking at his behavior in the media interviews, looking at his polygraph test, and looking at his nonverbal body language, and just his demeanor in general before the arrest. That all indicated that he was very guilty. He was hiding something. He was lying. That's how we arrive at the conclusion of total guilt. But the issue there is total guilt is not the same as partial guilt. One can also be guilty of all crimes, and one can also be guilty of one crime and a set of crimes and innocent of another. So in actuality, it's not black and white. It's not the case that if there are 3 crimes committed, if you're acting guilty, you must have necessarily committed all 3 crimes, because those indicators don't tell you how guilty they are. They only tell you that there's guilt. They only tell you that they're hiding something. These indicators don't tell you everything. They don't tell you whether it's partial guilt or total guilt. So when you have multiple crimes, it's really important to not make that jump. So it's possible for one person to be innocent of one crime and also be guilty of a different but related heinous crime. Crimes should be judged according to a nuanced understanding of the facts, not an all or nothing black and white understanding. So what I'm doing here is I really want to understand a more nuanced way of looking at this. Instead of just saying, because Chris acted guilty, because he failed the polygraph test, because he was lying, that means he's guilty of everything. I'm instead going to say, okay, there's evidence of guilt, there's evidence of I'm holding something back, I'm not telling the truth, I feel guilty, I feel like I'm not telling the truth and that's impacting my body language. I don't want to take that and just assume he killed everyone, because that doesn't mean that. That only means that he's hiding something. It doesn't mean he's hiding everything. Victim status does not erase guilt of a separate crime. So you can be a victim of one crime in a set of crimes, and you can be guilty of another. So victim status does not grant a pardon for separate crimes. So this is why it's not unreasonable to assess, to evaluate, to analyze Shanann Watts when you haven't given that disclaimer at the front. I'm not giving that disclaimer. I'm not going to say that I'm not going to say she was at fault for this, she was at fault for that, she might be liable for this, she might be liable for that. Because I don't know. That's the purpose of this investigation. We have a lot of good reason to believe that Chris physically caused the death of Shanann Watts, but we don't know who physically caused the death of the two girls. It could have been her, it could have been Chris. So, and we don't really know for sure who killed them, right? And we don't know why. So, somebody killed two completely innocent girls in their beds that night, most likely. And if it was Shanann Watts, then that is a heinous crime. It's just as heinous if Chris did it. And monsters do that. So, what can we reasonably conclude by way of armchair mental health diagnostics? When I say Shanann, likely has this disorder or that disorder, what exactly do I mean by that? It's a very tricky thing, you know, when you're not licensed, when you're not a professional, even when you are licensed, even when you are a professional, it's very tricky to articulate exactly what you mean when you're making a video like this, because, you know, Goldwater rule and you have rules within your practice, whatever. It's really tricky because, like, when you name a disorder, when you name this disorder, name that disorder in reference to an individual person that you've evaluated by whatever means, what exactly do you mean by that? Because outside of a clinic, you're not signing a piece of paper that says, I'm diagnosing this patient with this disorder for insurance purposes. Here, when it's just discourse on the internet, like, how do you articulate exactly what you mean? Like, am I saying that I think she definitely has this disorder, or do I mean that I think she might have had it? What's the most useful way of articulating that? And what exactly can you mean? Because you don't have access to the individual, because you don't have standardized tests, how accurate can you expect yourself to be? You know, even in clinical settings, people get it wrong all the time, but especially out here, when you don't have any of the tools that you need to do a comprehensive evaluation, how certain can you be of any conclusion that you reach? Not very certain. So the model I've used in the past says, if I am going to identify a particular disorder that a particular individual that I think they have, then I'm going to say, I think there is a X% chance that individual would be diagnosed with this disorder by a competent, qualified mental health professional who is studied in the respective area. That's how I normally do it. Instead of just throwing out this disorder saying I think she probably has it, I instead say I'm this percent certain that she would be diagnosed with this disorder by the qualified person. So that's how I intend to do it here. So an example of that is, I think it is 40% likely that a competent licensed clinician would diagnose this person with narcissistic personality disorder after conducting a thorough clinical assessment model. I'm just throwing out MPD. Why is the alternative, throw out a disorder and say she probably has it, approach a bad approach? Because we don't know what is meant by that. And when we don't know what's meant by that, we can come to some very incorrect conclusions. And because of how limited our knowledge is, because of how limited our ability to make assertions is, we really need to know exactly what is meant by this diagnosis or that diagnosis or this armchair diagnosis, so to speak. So I'm going to do my best to articulate that as succinctly as possible at the end of this. So the goal of this video the conclusion of this analysis will, by the end of this video, I will have explained exactly how I determined that Shanann's behavior was sufficiently maladaptive to warrant a full-length analysis. Why, as opposed to the analysis I did for Chris, where I didn't really do a full-length analysis. Also, why it constituted a pattern of behavior rather than an isolated incident in general. Why I don't believe I have it in my analysis succumbed to confirmation bias, and why the behavior was unlikely to be the result of normal human responses to extraordinary circumstances. So this is my mice model that I kind of made up myself. So M, maladaptiveness, how bad is it? Are they bleeding out, or is it just a scratch? And then isolated incident or pattern of behavior. How pervasive is this? Is this just like one thing that happened every once in a while? Or is it something that's constantly reoccurring in everyday aspects of life throughout different areas of life? And then C, confirmation bias. Am I just cherry picking, or am I just scooping up all of the evidence no matter what it says? And then finally, extraordinary circumstances. Is this person on fire, in flames, because someone's holding a torch to them, or is it because they spontaneously combusted? We need to know, like, what's causing this behavior. Is it something inside, or is it something outside that would reasonably cause a person to behave in an unusual way? So, also, after this video, I hope to have given my assessment of the probability that each prominent diagnosis would be diagnosed by a professional conducting a thorough clinical assessment. Also, I will have identified the diagnosis that I believe would have been the most productive, and I emphasize productive, because that's the end goal of diagnostics, primarily. And finally, by the end of this video, I will have explained why I think other diagnoses, while they may appear to be valid on paper, would not have been the most productive. So this was not an easy video to make for a few reasons. Reason number one, there's no access to tools like clinical interview, where you sit down with the person and ask them a standardized list of questions. And there's no standardized diagnostic testing like on a piece of paper like the MMPI. These are extremely useful tools for a variety of reasons, and we don't have access to any of those. So that's a problem. Second one, many of the suspected diagnoses are immensely complex. A lot of the diagnoses that I'm going to be talking about are personality disorders. Personality disorders are notoriously complex. Number three, many of the suspected diagnoses involve significant symptom overlap that can be difficult to perceive clearly. So personality disorders, again, are very infamous for a lot of symptom overlap, especially in cluster B. You have a lot of symptoms that are common across many different disorders, and correctly delineating the disorders can be very tricky, especially for a layperson, even for experienced professionals. And that's why there's long sections in the DSM that try to help you, guide you through that process, by pointing out like the key aspects of this, the key aspects of that you're looking for. And then finally, 90% of the information we have about this individual, Shanann Watts, is strongly influenced by a unique, poorly understood sociocultural context, that of the MLM that is Thrive, or Lavelle, whatever. So 90% of the information we have on Shanann Watts is heavily influenced by an MLM. Most of the information we have of Shanann's affect, of Shanann's everyday behavior, is exclusively related to her friends in Thrive, to her work in Thrive, to her marketing efforts in Thrive. Because of the nature of MLMs, this can potentially severely distort our understanding of the individual, because the external stuff becomes so hardwired into the person that it's very difficult to perceive what is coming from the MLM and what is actually coming from the person. So that's another very big issue that makes it very difficult to say anything with any level of certainty regarding diagnoses. So now we will get into it. So general profile, we're going to start off with Ocean, or 5-factor model, Big 5. So extremely high. Shanann is extremely high in extroversion given her cell phone activity and a long list of close friends. So one of the most notable aspects of her person is she has a lot of friends. She has almost too many friends, and they're all very close friends, and she's constantly on her phone. We know this from the cell phone records and from witness testimony. She is constantly on her phone. If she hasn't texted anyone in 20 minutes, people are already worried about her. It's very obvious evidence of extremely high extroversion. General intelligence, this isn't necessarily 5-factor model, but she is high in emotional social intelligence given her success in sales, not just in Thrive, but also in other MLMs and also professionally. And her ability to get large groups of people to watch her rambling live streams. So she clearly has enough emotional intelligence to get large numbers of people to listen to her for extended periods of time when she's talking about basically nothing. All right. So also her lifelong ability to make large sums of money quickly through business skills. What I learned about her was that on multiple occasions throughout her life, she bought a really expensive house. And she's I think she started a business, or she worked with someone else who started a business. And we see consistently throughout her life that she's very able to start with very little and use her sales skills, use her people skills, use her emotional intelligence to make large sums of money through sales very quickly. So this is evidence of fairly high emotional intelligence and social intelligence. Openness to experience appears to be low, since she rarely spends time talking about ideas and concepts, and instead spends the vast majority of her time talking about people and basic objects and basic single-faceted ideas. So in all the live streams I've watched, she rarely delves into any complex subjects, basically. So this is evidence of lower openness to experience, and she doesn't really appear to have many interests outside of what she talks about in her live streams. And her live streams are very limited to specific subjects. So probably pretty low in openness to experience, but not terribly low. Not autistic low. Agreeableness here is tricky. She appears to be highly agreeable outwardly, but seems to have some empathy impairments, inappropriate antagonism towards others, and aggression in some circumstances that put this in question. So this is very tricky. Not sure what exactly to think of that, other than it's kind of not clear. Not enough information to really say where she is on that spectrum. Not horribly low, not horribly high, I don't think. Probably somewhere in the middle. Neuroticism appears to be quite high due to her reported strong negative reactions to not getting what she wants. We do have some reports of rage, inappropriate rage, in situations where someone doesn't pick up the phone, or someone doesn't get home on time, or we do have some evidence of that kind of behavior, which is evidence of high neuroticism. This is also due to her lifelong health challenges that she consistently reports have a very strong impact on her mood, very strong negative impact on her mood. And due to her extreme reaction to her fears of the affair. So, not talking about the crimes. This is before the crimes, just ignoring everything during and after October 13th. Before the crimes, in the text messages, we see a lot of evidence that she is probably overreacting to her fears of the affair, and it's having an extremely negative impact on her psyche, on her emotionality. She's extremely upset about it to the point of being physically sick. So this is evidence of high neuroticism, and what we mean by high neuroticism is the person has difficulty with stress. Stress has a larger impact on them. They don't cope with negative feelings very well. So emotional affect, what I wrote originally was that there's nothing particularly remarkable. I'm not sure if I agree with that now. We're starting to get to the part where I'm starting to disagree with myself, because this is a very tricky thing, especially with the limited information. She does have a very powerful affect, right? Definitely not blended affect like Chris. Very strong, very emotional, pretty congruent. She's very vibrant and potentially superficial, but not necessarily to the point of clinical relevance. This will come into play later with histrionic personality disorder, where we'll discuss it more. But there certainly is some evidence of some of the speech patterns that you would expect to see in histrionic personality disorder that are characterized by speaking at great lengths about things that seem hollow, getting really super excited about stuff that most people wouldn't get super excited about, really the range of emotions get really high and then they get really low, almost too quickly to be felt. That's coming from the DSM. But in general, we do have that very powerful affect that oftentimes doesn't necessarily seem terribly genuine. That's the most important takeaway there. So primary attachment figures in life, not much is known about her relationship with her parents and with her siblings. Don't have a lot of information on that. We have some reports, but not enough for me to be confident that I can make an assertion about it. It's notable that we have many text messages and evidence of her sharing her fears about Chris's alleged affair with many of her friends, particularly with Lavelle. But we don't appear to see her sharing any of these thoughts and concerns with her parents or siblings, even when she becomes extremely distraught to the point of physical illness. So we see that pattern of her consistently sharing, oh my God, I think he might be cheating. Oh my God, what am I going to do? My life is completely being ripped apart right now, and I'm crying, and I'm not sleeping, and I'm crying all day, and I can't, and I'm puking. We see her sharing that with a lot of her friends, but we don't see her sharing it with her friends and with her family, with her parents and her siblings. So this lack of evidence isn't necessarily evidence of absence, but it is notable. You might expect to see that, and we don't see it. So that is a point in the direction of maybe not as strong a relationship with her original family. But that's hardly relevant, honestly. So her family often played a big role in helping her raise her children, which is odd. So we had very long periods of time where Shanann's parents came and lived with the Watts family, with Shanann and Chris and the girls. And we also had long periods of time where I think Chris's parents did the same, which is odd. It's not normal. And it does raise some questions about, I'll leave it there for now. So friendships seemed like the discovery listed 5 separate women who were all supposed to be her best friend. So a lot of friends, a lot of people who are supposedly very close to her. Some friends knew intimate details of her everyday life that only a household member would typically know. So they knew her daily habits, like where she put her shoes in the morning, where she put this in the morning, where she put that at night, how she slept. These are very intimate details of daily life that are not normally known by people who aren't living inside that house. So that indicates a lot of interactions with these people that aren't necessarily normal with these friends. She exchanged good morning text messages with some of these friends, which seems a bit much. Again, to the last point. It takes about 5 minutes to scroll through 1 week's worth of her Facebook posts. So this is going back to the extremely high extroversion, a lot of cell phone use, a lot of social media use, and this goes back to the MLM. But there's a lot of interaction with friends, is the point. 80% of her time and energy appears to be devoted to her job with Thrive and friends directly associated with that, while only about 20% is left over for her family. Because I'm judging that based on just the Facebook, it's very difficult for me to know for sure if that number, if that ratio 80-20 is anywhere close to reality, but that's my impression. But it's certainly not a confident assertion, but that is the appearance. So that 80-20 split, which is not healthy at all, obviously. Which means friendships are taking up too much of her energy, of her person. A lot of responsibility for this may be on Thrive, the MLM, and their marketing tactics. It could also be more about the specific downline she was part of, but we'll get to MLMs very shortly. She appears to draw much of her energy and confidence from things associated with this MLM, but this will be discussed in depth in a future video. So there will be a video on MLMs, I believe, but now I have the slide for MLMs. So there are two completely different models for understanding MLMs. It appears as though there are two types that I'm aware of, that I've personally interacted with. Particularly in Thrive Lavelle, you have the version, the downline, the group, if you will, that are like Shanann's, where you have extremely high extroversion. You have that 80-20 split between how much of my personal life is on the internet, how much of it is not. These people are extremely extroverted. They go on all the groups, they go on all the outings, they're all friends with each other. It's a lot of extroversion. It's extremely extroverted. And then you have other groups that are drastically different, that are not necessarily less extroverted, but they're much more private. And I interacted with someone who is a member of one of those groups, who had a higher rank within that marketing company than Shanann did. And this individual was extremely private online in her marketing strategies. So there's two different ways of getting high up in that company, is what I've learned. So it's not necessarily, so all of this behavior isn't necessarily just from the MLM. It's not necessarily true that we can pile all that garbage in the MLM, because it's not the only way to succeed in the MLM. Now the other question is it specific to the downline that you're in, or is it specific to the individual? Can the individual decide, I'm going to run this company, this marketing business in a very private way, and it's going to be okay? Or is it like, if you happen to be in the wrong downline, you have to be extremely not private, you have to be extremely extroverted? Or if you end up in a very private downline, you don't have to be extroverted, and you might even be penalized for being so extroverted. I don't know the answer to that question, but the fact that question exists makes the certainty much lower of anything that I can assert. And by the way, the birthday cake pro bars, I tried them. They're not anywhere as good as they're chalked up to be. So romantic relationships. Her marriage with Chris appears to be stable over time with few fights. I think they were married for 8 years, I think. Occasionally, Shanann acts like Chris's mother, which indicates an unhealthy power dynamic. But the question here, is this because of IQ gap, or is this because of personality? It appears to be mostly because of personality, but it's unclear because, we can't ask questions. Chris reports not being able to be himself around Shanann early on in the marriage, so this indicates she has a very dominant personality that makes it so that this relationship pair is not necessarily healthy. Shanann has control over the finances of this family, but to what extent is unclear. It is notable, however, that she gets updates sent to her phone when Chris's purchase card gets used. She gets instant notifications whenever his credit card gets used, which is not even which isn't even appropriate when you're in a professional setting. It's just not. It's very unusual for someone to be signing up to get instant alerts anytime someone else's purchase card gets used. It's just not normal. So excessive spending through Thrive that crippled the family financially and jeopardized Chris's own finances, potentially making him dependent. So this is sort of building a case for some possible financial abuse on Shanann's part, because she had that excessive spending, and there were some actions that were taken that, made Chris a little bit more dependent than he necessarily needed to be. There's no evidence of domestic violence, and to be specific, that's talking about. I think I researched it. There's some issues with whose name the house was in. I think it was entirely in Chris's name. I think that's the primary issue. Third bullet, there is evidence of financial abuse. There is evidence of excessive controlling of Chris on Shanann's part. There is evidence of rage towards Chris when she doesn't get her way. This is from testimony of Chris and of his friends who report, if I can't get to the airport, I think the issue was, one of the specific reports that I remember is Chris was supposed to drive and get someone from the airport, and he couldn't do it because he hadn't picked up his room, or he hadn't picked up the basement, I think it was. And Shanann wouldn't let him leave until he picked up the basement to go get his friend from the airport. So that's extremely interesting. So there is evidence of rage towards Chris when she doesn't get her way. I think I said that. Many of these things were likely swept under the rug because of Chris's extremely high agreeableness and low neuroticism. So when you have that very high agreeableness and the low neuroticism, that allows the person, Chris, to just be a punching bag, basically, and not do anything about it. So this unfortunately makes a terrific target for some of this more covert abusive behavior. So as you look at some of this evidence that I'll probably dive into later on, the important thing to consider is, if you flip the genders and apply common sense to it, would this be abuse? If a wife were acting this way towards a husband, would you think this was an abusive relationship? If the answer is automatically yes, then flip the genders back, and it's probably still abuse even though the genders are flipped. That's the basic logic that can lead you to some pretty interesting conclusions. So we're going to go back to the mice model, those 4 letters that I've developed to help me determine whether or not certain behaviors constitute clinical relevance, constitute diagnosis. So again, maladaptiveness, isolated incident or pattern of behavior, confirmation bias, and extraordinary circumstances. So what we're going to do now is we're going to look at each of these letters, each of these 4 points, M, I, C, and E, and we're going to ask the behaviors that we've noted that Shanann has, do these pass the test? Do these jump over the entire hurdle? So each of these is a hurdle, basically. Kind of like standards of evidence, right? So maladaptiveness as to Shanann, we see significant evidence of harm being done to her family on a regular basis as a direct result of specifically Shanann's empathy impairment. So when we look at basically any Facebook Live that Shanann is in with her children, we consistently see over and over and over again, in many different contexts, a pattern where Shanann demonstrates that empathy impairment towards the kids. That is not normal. That she mocks the kids for being upset, which is pretty clear evidence of empathy impairment. It's not normal to mock people for being upset, especially when they're your children. And it's certainly not normal to make sport of it. It's just not normal. Chris appeared to consistent, and is this maladaptive enough to be clinically relevant? I would say it's on the line, and that's because there's a lot of it. It's not just one little thing here, one little thing there. It's consistently. Every time she's on camera with these children, we consistently see this. We consistently see the kids getting upset, getting very upset in some circumstances as a direct result of Shanann's complete lack of empathy towards them. And there are so many examples of this. So I would say it's probably maladaptive enough to be clinically relevant as it pertains to Shanann's impact on her children specifically. So Chris appeared to consistently live in Shanann's world and did not appear to feel safe being his own person in the relationship. For example, by walking through his house, so if you were to just walk through his house, one would never suspect he was into cars and sports. Whenever we see like the body cam videos, the Facebook lives, when you look at this house, you would never suspect that the husband, that the man of the house, was into NASCAR, was into football, was into baseball. You would never think that he was a mechanic, right? And that's not normal. You would normally expect to see, stuff on the walls, right? You expect to see tools lying around. But this is very clearly Shanann's house. It's not the kid's house. It's not Chris's house. It's Shanann's house. Everything looks the way Shanann wants it to look. So that's definitely not normal. And is that clinically maladaptive? By itself, probably not, but cumulatively, it builds a case. Fairly notable financial challenges throughout her life, which led to bankruptcy once early in life, and this was also likely leading to a second bankruptcy before the murders. So we have a long-standing pattern of Shanann consistently buying lots of stuff to have an appearance, right? And it's stuff she can't afford, and she consistently has financial problems. They had one bankruptcy early on in marriage, and by the looks of it, they were headed down that same road, and a lot of that probably has to do with the MLM. So we have to consider that. And on top of the MLM, there is a lot of spending on Shanann's part that is very obvious just by looking at the Facebook videos, looking at some of her Facebook posts. So there's quite a bit of spending going on, but at the point where it's clinically maladaptive, it is unclear. So isolated incidents or pattern of behavior. This is tricky because the vast majority of our information comes from Thrive videos. So within the context of Thrive, this behavior is extremely consistent. But we have to take into consideration that this is within a particular socio-cultural context. And the DSM is very clear that, that matters when you're trying to make a diagnosis. Some behaviors are noted to be consistent across about 2 years' time, others throughout life. So the spending problems appear to be consistent throughout life. But the empathy impairments, we don't have evidence of that before the MLM, before the Facebook videos. So that is not helpful if we're trying to learn whether or not certain diagnoses are relevant. It's unclear if these empathy impairments behaviors permeated outside the Thrive videos. In the context of the MLM, all behaviors are well-established patterns that repeat over time in different types of events relating to Thrive marketing. So the evidence we have a lot of it in one specific context, but all of that evidence points in the same direction. So it's pretty safe to say that most of these behaviors clear this hurdle. Confirmation bias. Am I cherry picking? Let's find out. What I'm looking for is signs that someone is doing something and that others are negatively impacted as a direct result. We see this quite consistently with Shanann. As much evidence has been gathered And throughout this process, I'm gathering as much evidence as possible without, trying to just cherry pick. I'm trying to just get all of it in the same basket and analyze all of it at the same time. All relevant traits have been laid out to include the adaptive ones, which is why I'm doing the general analysis before I do any of the personality disorder stuff. I'm not just focusing on this detail or on that detail, but rather the holistic image. And I think you'll agree with that. If you don't, let me know. Extraordinary circumstances. This is the last one, the E in mice. The suspected affair devolved into an extraordinary circumstance, but it did not start out that way. So we're talking about her behavior, her reaction towards her fears of Chris abandoning her, of Chris ignoring her, of Chris having an affair. How did she react to Chris's emotional detachment from the family? Her behavior early on is likely to be clinically relevant, but as it became more and more certain he was cheating, her known behavior can be adequately explained by the circumstances. So you have two parts. Part one, where it's not necessarily certain that Chris is actually cheating on her, and the reasons for being upset are pretty minimal. Then you have part two, where it's pretty clear that she's being cheated on. It's pretty clear that she's about to go through a divorce. So part one, her reaction to it appears to be clinically relevant, but in part two, this can be adequately explained by the extraordinary circumstance of all of a sudden the spouse is leaving for no apparent reason. The MLM can likely serve as an extraordinary circumstance when assessing the spending problems during those 2 years, right? But not necessarily before the MLM, obviously. So those spending habits do tend to be lifelong, or do appear to be lifelong. The MLM cannot serve as a sufficient extraordinary circumstance when explaining the empathy impairment, excessive dominance, and excessive need for control in the marriage. So we see a lot of antagonism that Shanann displays towards others in the Facebook Lives, a lot of empathy impairments, and I don't think that that's explained. I don't think that can be explained by the MLM. I don't think the MLM is training her to do that. And I don't think that that's serving her cause. I don't think that's making her sell more Thrive products. So it's reasonable to attribute that to personality. So how to explain these possible clinically relevant behaviors? So now is when I'm going to list out a bunch of disorders. Antisocial personality disorder, ASPD, big fat no. I definitely do not think that that is even close to being a helpful diagnosis. Borderline personality disorder, we're going to talk about that. That's questionable. Narcissistic personality disorder, questionable. Histrionic personality disorder, questionable. Obsessive compulsive personality disorder, not OCD, but commonly mistaken for OCD. The personality disorder is questionable. Intermittent explosive disorder is unlikely, but possible. Somatic symptom disorder is unknown, because I don't have her medical records. I'm not a doctor. Factitious disorder imposed on another, or by proxy. I didn't look it up when I wrote this. I forget what the proper union of those two is. But if you know what I'm talking about, you know what I'm talking about. That's suspicious. And we'll get into those later on. So some other disorders: depression, anxiety, bipolar disorder, diabetes, psychopathy, sociopathy, adjustment disorder, eating disorders, OCD, ADHD. None of these seem to be particularly relevant. Depression is certainly at play during the lead up to the murders, but to the point where diagnosing that would be helpful is diagnosing that after the fact is probably not going to be helpful. Anxiety, unclear. Bipolar disorder, I'm not seeing any evidence of that. Diabetes, there was the claim about her blood sugar being low the night before the murders. I think if she was diabetic, we would know. And people without diabetes can experience low blood sugar when they're on a fast. You don't need to be diabetic to get hypoglycemic. So I don't think there's any reason to suspect diabetes. Psychopathy, that's sort of the same as antisocial personality disorder. I don't see any evidence of that. Sociopathy, same. Adjustment disorder, it's kind of tricky, but I don't think that's at play either. Eating disorders, I think we would have known about that given all the information we have, so I don't think that's at play. OCD, I don't see any bizarre behavior, so I don't think that's at play. And ADHD could potentially be used to explain some of the habits, but I don't think it's really relevant in this case. So, what is the purpose of diagnostics? It's not to explain or prove criminal behavior, at least not clinically speaking. It's not to help the person, or it is to help. It's hard to read this thing from the angle. The purpose of diagnostics is to help the person be a better person. So, when we diagnose someone, we're not trying to peg them with something we can use to prosecute, right? We're looking at the person, we're asking, what diagnosis or what method of understanding their behavior would lead to the most positive outcome? That's probably a really good way of guiding your diagnostic process. The best diagnosis is the one that leads to the most positive treatment outcomes, right? A good way of looking at it is to imagine sitting in the room with the person, and then you have to imagine yourself trying to help them and live a better life. So if I'm having all this, if me personally, I'm having all this difficulty really isolating a single personality disorder that fits the profile best, if I'm having all these second thoughts, I have to put myself in the room with this individual and say, if I were in this room with this individual right now, if she were still alive, how would I help this person? Not necessarily through the lens of a diagnosis, but how is this person struggling? What can be done about it? Okay. Which diagnosis sums up Shanann's biggest problems in life? Let's go to the next slide. Number 1, she makes her husband feel bad about himself because she's too bossy and controlling. He doesn't even feel like he can put up a picture without getting her permission first. This was discussed in text messages with Shanann, so we know this was an issue that she was even aware of. So that's issue number 1. She needs to get her spending under control because it's threatening to ruin her life. That's pretty clear. And that's a big issue. Like if you look at the hierarchy of needs, one of the, you have emotional needs, you have physical needs, you have bodily needs. Financial needs are pretty high. So that's important. Also, she needs to bond with her family more, because she's spending so much of her family bonding time on Facebook, which is not healthy. She needs to spend more time working on self-development and less time projecting a picture-perfect image for Thrive, because nobody's life is picture-perfect. She needs more private time, probably. Like these extremely high levels of extroversion probably aren't healthy. And she needs to work on managing anger, I think. I think if she were here, she would probably agree with most of this stuff. But that's my assessment. And I think that, those are some things that she was struggling with. So we'll go on. So if we applied this to criminal investigation, we have someone who has too much control over their family, and their personality defects are allowed to grow and grow unchecked. So when we have this one dominant figure in the relationship who is so dominant that the other figure is basically another child at times, and when that person has personality defects that are allowed to grow and grow and grow unfettered without anything saying, hey, you need to stop this, when it's never checked, that's a concern. That creates potential for criminality, potentially. Bullet 2. This person has too much responsibility, too many expectations. So we're trying to build a profile of someone who might commit a crime here. This person doesn't appear to have healthy coping mechanisms, certainly not for intensely stressful events. So we hear Shanann talk a lot about herself and a lot about how Thrive has helped her with her health challenges, with her emotional challenges. But that's not necessarily a very healthy, good coping mechanism for stress, especially with higher levels of stress, with more extreme stress like divorce. This person has made her entire family and her entire identity utterly dependent on her husband. Okay? This person may not know how to handle an extreme amount of stress in a healthy way. Okay? So this is the profile we're building of Shanann that could lead to criminality. So let's apply this back to mental health diagnostics. We have someone presenting chiefly with excessive control, which indicates OCPD, or obsessive compulsive personality disorder. That's what a lot of people mean by OCD. OCD is much more about repetitive behaviors, about odd behaviors, like knocking, or like opening a door and shutting it 3 times before you walk into a room, that sort of thing. The like super organized spaces, the labeling everything in the closet, that's more consistent with obsessive compulsive personality disorder and not OCD. So that's easily confused. We also see an inability to be alone, which appears to be consistent with BPD as well as HPD. BPD is borderline personality disorder. HPD is histrionic personality disorder. We also see excessive spending, which is consistent with a lot of cluster B, no particular disorder. And we also see emotional volatility, which is consistent with a lot of cluster B. And by cluster B, if you're not aware, I mean a lot of personality disorders like histrionic, borderline, narcissistic, antisocial, and not dependent. I think there's one more that I'm forgetting. That's cluster B. And then we also have empathy impairment, which is consistent with a lot of cluster B. And I'll add, that's not on the PowerPoint, we have that very strong affect, which is consistent with histrionic personality disorder, HPD. None of this stuff points to any particular disorder with any certainty. There's a lot of symptom overlap. A lot of the symptoms we're talking about overlap with a lot of others. So that makes it difficult. The likelihood of a full-blown personality disorder here is very low, because the level of maladaptiveness is not so high that it would be likely to necessitate a full-blown a diagnosis of a full-blown clinical personality disorder. Because again, people with full-blown clinical personality disorders have extreme disruption in their lives as a direct result of the personality disorder. These are people who are in pain. These are people who are not working well in society. These people are experiencing extreme problems in life. And I don't really see that in Shanann as much as I would expect to see in someone experiencing a full-blown personality disorder. So narcissism, we'll go into that briefly. That seems to jump out. If you look at all the symptom criteria, a lot of it fits. But I don't think she has it, because when you read the actual manual and the DSM, when you read the description on, okay, how do you actually diagnose this? Not just looking at the symptom criteria, but when you actually look at the description in the DSM, it's very clear that if you're going to diagnose someone with narcissistic personality disorder, it has to be chiefly characterized by the grandiosity. Even if it's not overt, you have to see a clear pattern of, I'm better than everyone else. That type of thinking, and I don't see that in Shanann. I don't see the grandiosity. So the grandiosity is absolutely essential for that disorder, which is why I've ruled it out. I don't think that would be the most helpful disorder, because the primary issue is not she thinks she's better than everyone else. It's she's having a lot of emotional regulation problems, she's having a lot of anger problems, she's having a lot of spending problems, and she's having problems with being center of attention too much. too much extroversion, too much emotional affect. And that's not, while some of that is consistent with narcissistic personality disorder, it's not particularly indicative of narcissistic personality disorder. And the emotional manipulation, the emotional abuse she may have been putting on Chris, a lot of people jump to the conclusion that that must be narcissistic personality disorder. It's not. That can be consistent with a lot of cluster B, not just narcissistic personality disorder, not just antisocial personality disorder. All right, so borderline personality disorder is a strong candidate, in my opinion. It is my view that this type of symptomatology was primarily at play when she was reacting to Chris withdrawing, particularly towards the end. But this is very tricky because I'm not even sure if I agree with that anymore. It's really difficult to delineate. See, you have, is this person, when you read her text messages, is she reacting to fears of, oh my God, he's leaving me, he's abandoning me, I'm going to die if he leaves me? Or is she reacting like this? Oh my God, he's ignoring me. He's acting like I'm invisible. He's acting like I don't even exist, so I'm already dead, basically. Figuring out which of those two archetypes she fits most closely, is very difficult, and consistently over the years, or over like the past 2 years really, I've consistently ended up concluding that it's more likely to be histrionic. It's more likely to be the attention-seeking archetype. Occasionally, like when I look at it briefly, after I haven't looked at it in a while, I resort to borderline, but I don't stay there. I always end up going back to histrionic. So with borderline, you have the chief component of borderline is fear of abandonment, and the chief component of histrionic is fear of being invisible, right? And it's difficult to figure out, and it's basically impossible, honestly, to figure out which one it is. But we'll get to some more things we can do to delineate that later on. So the second bullet point here, it may be consistent with HBD, but there's no flirtatiousness. So we don't see a lot of flirtatiousness with Shanann. We don't see her dressing in a sexually provocative way, which is something we would expect in histrionic personality disorder. It's not required. I believe there are 9 symptom criteria, and you need to have 5. I know it's that way with borderline, but I don't have that in front of me right now. I can pull it up, though. Pull it up. I believe it's 5 out of 9 you have to have. Yeah, it's 5 out of 8 actually for histrionic, and it's 5 out of 9 for borderline. So you don't necessarily have to have the flirtatiousness. Number 1 is uncomfortable in situations when she is not the center of attention. That's very clear. I think that criteria is met. Number 2, interaction with others is often characterized by inappropriate sexually seductive or provocative behavior. I don't see that with her. I don't see the sexual component, and I don't see the flirtatiousness component, which makes me suspicious that it's not HBD. But this is 1 of 8, and you only need 5. So 3 of these can be thrown out and still have a clinical diagnosis. Number 3, displays rapidly shifting, shallow expression of emotions. I do see that in her quite a lot. Number 4, consistently uses physical appearance to draw attention to self. I'm not sure what exactly is meant by that. I don't know if that is specific to your body, like your clothing, or if that can extend to the house you live in, the car you drive. So I'm not sure about that, but if it does extend to like the house you live in, the things you buy, the way you project your financial situation, if it can be extended to that, I would say that, yeah, she definitely meets that criteria. And that's really difficult to distinguish from narcissism, right? Is this person acting this way to project a grandiose image that's I'm better than everyone else, or is it she just wants attention? It's difficult to figure out. Number 5, has a style of speech that is excessively impressionistic and lacking in detail. In her Facebook live streams, I would say that symptom criteria is met, but the extent to which the MLM is interfering with this is unclear. Number 6 shows self-dramatizations, theatricality, and exaggerated expression of emotion. I would say that's most likely met. And considers relationships to be more intimate than they actually are. See, this is where being able to actually talk to some of her former friends would be really helpful. I would want to ask, did you consider her to be your best friend? Or did she consider herself to be your best friend, but you didn't really know her that well? Because with histrionic personality disorder, we tend to see the histrionic person thinks, oh, this person's my best friend, that person's my best friend, that person's my best friend, but you go talk to those 3 people, and they're like, I barely even know her. So I'd be curious to know how that dynamic worked. But, we see a lot of friends. But, in that social-cultural context, it's difficult to, it's a very different socio-cultural context where everyone's friend in this MLM. So it's really tricky. That's why, this is such a difficult video to make, and the assertion I make at the end is not very confident because of this lack of information. So that's the symptom criteria of histrionic. I could go through the other ones as well. But yeah, I'll go back to the PowerPoint now. Yeah, it's very difficult. That's why this video is very hard to make, and the conclusion of it is not very certain of anything, really. The third bullet here, her early behavior towards Chris is not consistent with histrionic personality disorder, and it's more consistent with BPD or NPD. So the way she tells the story, the way Chris tells the story of how they met, is not consistent with histrionic because she pushes him away rather than tries to pull him in. That's not necessarily consistent with any. That's not necessarily a product of a personality disorder. But if you're just looking at the person holistically, like how does this person act, not necessarily looking for symptom criteria, but just assessing the individual holistically, I would say that's not consistent with HBD. It's more consistent with with the borderline and narcissistic archetypes rather than HBD. That's why it's so tricky. General personality disorder. It's a real disorder. It's not fake. It's very attractive. But it's basically the same thing as saying unspecified personality disorder. So, I could very confidently assert that she could be diagnosed with general personality disorder. That's much less complex because you're saying, I don't know, right? I don't have enough information. This is probably the safest diagnosis to make if you were actually to assert she must have this, she must have that. But it's not very useful for understanding the person. Because it's basically just saying, I don't know. Which may be the best thing to say in this case. So HBD, this has consistently been the most likely candidate. Like I said, when I leave the case, when I come back to it, I consistently come back to HBD. Even though I consistently start off with other diagnoses, I go through the same processes of thinking, and I always end back at HBD. Okay, so this is primarily identifiable through that strong emotionality and constant need to be at the center of attention. Shanann's text messages leading up to the murders could very easily be interpreted as, he's treating me like I'm invisible, and that makes me feel like I'm literally dead already. But that could also be BPD. I don't really know for sure, but that's what I just keep coming back to. BPD is unlikely because we don't see a ton of unstable self-image, and there isn't much evidence of splitting. So in BPD, one of the primary components of BPD is unstable image, you're over-identifying with other people because you're out of touch with your own sense of self, and you see a lot of dramatic fluctuations between overvaluing people, overvaluing primary attachment figures, and then suddenly devaluing them. And we have some evidence of that with Shanann and Chris, but not enough for me to say that BPD is likely. Because if it were the case, you would probably expect to see more evidence of it. You'd probably expect to hear Chris complaining about it. But we don't see that. So that's why I'm less inclined to think it's BPD. So the conclusion at the end of the day is HPD, histrionic personality disorder. What I am saying is that I think that there is a 51% chance that a competent licensed clinician who has recently studied personality disorders would have diagnosed Shanann Watts with histrionic personality disorder after a full assessment. So the reason I say 51% chance is because the reason I say 51% and not like 75% is because so much of our information of this individual is heavily polluted by the MLM, right? And because I can't talk to her, I can't ask her questions, there's no MMPI, there's no testing whatsoever, I can only go to 51%. I'm saying I think this is most likely, but I can't assert any further than that, right? So that's why 51%. And I'm just not sure, but I'm enough sure that I can say it's more than 50 and it's about 51. All right. And the reason I say a licensed clinician who has recently studied personality disorders is because histrionic personality disorder is not very popular anymore. A lot of people don't know about it, or not very well studied on it, so that's why I included that there, because it's kind of fallen out of favor. Not a lot of people diagnose it anymore. After a full assessment. The next bullet point, I am also saying that a licensed expert on personality disorders who specializes specifically in personality disorders probably would not diagnose her with a full-blown clinical histrionic personality disorder. That is because I do think the issues are clinically relevant, but I don't think they're severe enough to truly warrant the full-blown clinical disorder. Because like I said, people who actually have these full-blown clinical disorders are extremely maladaptive, right? They're bleeding out. They're on fire. And I don't really see that level of maladaptiveness in Shanann. However, I found that most clinicians tend to diagnose much more quickly. What I'm trying to say there is a lot of people who don't specialize in personality disorders diagnose personality disorders a lot quicker than people who specialize in it would. And the primary reason for that is insurance. When you're one of the people who specialize in just personality disorders, you probably don't need to diagnose it as quickly as other clinicians. So that's the reason for bullet number 1. Alright, so now that we've come to this conclusion, what can we do with it? What could have been done with this information? Identifying that fear of being invisible is the key issue. So what could have been done with this information if she were still alive at the time? Identifying that fear of being invisible as the key issue would likely solve a lot of other problems. So what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to say, we have all these problems. Is there any one problem that might be driving all the others? So if you solve the one problem, then you solve everything else. Is it the case that you're not able to solve one of these small problems because it's being fueled by this bigger problem? And I think that this histrionic personality disorder might do that. This fear of invisibility seems to be driving the entire train. So now switching to treatment, possible treatment methods for a lot of these personality disorders, relational therapy is often considered the best treatment for this type of condition. Personality disorders is what I'm talking about. You need long periods of treatment with the same person for long periods of time, and what I mean by that is years and years and years. Medication is usually ineffective for personality disorders for the most part. So impact on the investigation, that's what we're all here for, right? This is important because when we want to understand an incomprehensible crime, we want to look for the person who is most in pain, and we want to understand their pain. We now understand that Shanann was in extreme pain. We also know why. So, an important thing about personality disorders, when they're close to the clinical severity, they all have a primary fear. The primary fear with narcissistic personality disorder is not being good enough. The primary fear in borderline is being abandoned. The primary fear in dependent personality disorder is being good enough. The primary fear in histrionic personality disorder is being invisible. When those fears are sufficiently provoked, the result is really bad, okay? These people feel like they're going to die when these fears reach their full intensity, okay? So when you have someone like Shanann, who appears to consistently be at the center of attention for her entire life, she has tools that she can use to get attention in basically all circumstances. These tools have always served her well. She needs to be at the center of attention because when she's not, she feels invisible, and feeling invisible is extremely scary for this person, okay? When all of a sudden her romantic partner, her husband, all of a sudden out of the blue no longer responds to those tools, when he all of a sudden treats her like she's invisible, and when nothing she does that used to works anymore, she feels invisible. And that's, to her, akin to murder. She feels like she's already dead. That's the power of these personality disorders. That's the curse of these things. They can be extremely painful when that core fear is sufficiently provoked. And that's what I'm getting at with this conclusion. Her entire life, she has always done everything possible to always be the center of attention. Chris has always given her all of his attention. Him suddenly depriving her of that and acting like she is invisible is her kryptonite. She already feels like she has been murdered. She is invisible. She feels dead. It's torture. That's what I got from reading her text messages. That's just a plain reading of it. Reading the discovery from page 1 to page 2000, and reading the whole story, word for word, page for page, especially reading her text messages in chronological order with everything else. That's what I understood. She felt like she was being tortured. She felt like she was already dead. This means she had something to gain from committing suicide by Chris that night. She had something to gain by dying, basically, is what I'm saying. Torture would hurt a whole lot less if everything just shut down and stopped. There was no way out for her. Everything was over. Her control over Chris was gone. She was going to suddenly lose all the attention she so desperately needed. I say that not just because she was losing Chris, but because she was losing her job in Thrive. She was losing the MLM. Her success in that MLM was dependent on Chris, was dependent on that perfect family picture. Take that out. Take away Chris's financial support. She has to move to North Carolina, away from all of her friends, away from the MLM. She can't afford it anymore. She can't live in Colorado. She needs to be with her family. She needs to be in an area with lower cost of living. So her world would end if Chris left. We know this because of a text message that she sent saying, I can't afford to live in Colorado with the kids if Chris leaves. So she was going to suddenly lose all the attention she so desperately needed, not just through Chris, but through the MLM as well, which is, so between Chris and the MLM, and the kids, that is basically all of her attention is coming from those three things. And at least two of those things are about to be completely ripped away from her. And there's nothing she can do about it because Chris is going to leave her anyway. Chris no longer is responsive to her needs. And that's the end of this analysis. That is the picture that I got of Shanann from reading the discovery, from reading all of the text messages in chronological order with everything else. That is the picture of Shanann that I have. Histrionic personality disorder. Someone with that disorder is being stretched to their limits. She feels like she's going to die. She feels like she's already dead. She feels like she's being tortured, and there's no way out. And that is Shanann Watts, the night of October 13th, or August 13th. That's what I understood from reading the discovery.